The sun hung low over Lake Ridge, casting molten gold across the water's surface. Mist curled around the pine trees like a slow, creeping fog, hiding secrets that only the quiet of the lake knew. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wet earth and cedar, mingling with the faint tang of gasoline from the old cabin nestled against the slope. It was the kind of place people dreamed about escaping to, a sanctuary from the noise of the world, but for someone, it was a battleground. I had finally purchased my slice of solitude, a weathered lake cabin, modest and humble, with creaking wooden floors and a wraparound porch that overlooked the shimmering waters. The paperwork was signed, the moving truck was en route, and yet, just as I set my first foot into my new haven, the distant sound of sirens echoed across the lake. The source? Karen Whitman, president of the Lake Ridge Homeowners Association, a woman who had made it her personal mission to control every inch of this peaceful neighborhood. Little did she know, her world was about to crumble, and mine was about to begin. I had dreamed about this day for years. Finally, after scraping together savings, working late nights at the publishing firm, and surviving the relentless city grind, I was moving into my lake cabin. The moving truck bounced along the gravel driveway, carrying boxes labeled in my messy handwriting, books, kitchen stuff, fragile. My name is Ethan Parker, and I am, by nature, a private man. I like the smell of the forest in the morning, the quiet lap of water against the dock at dusk, and the sense of isolation that comes with living somewhere the cell phone signal barely reaches. Lake Ridge, with its misty mornings and winding roads, had seemed perfect. Until Karen Whitman entered the picture. Karen, a woman in her mid-50s with an obsession for power and control, had been spreading rumors about the new outsider moving in. Her HOA meetings were legendary for their petty complaints and iron-fisted rules. No boats over 12 feet, no paint colors outside our approved palette, no moving trucks after 5 p.m. It was a world of minutiae, and Karen thrived in it. As I stepped onto the porch, my boots crunching against the gravel, I noticed a silver SUV parked at the edge of the property. Karen. Of course. She was wearing her usual crisp white blouse, her hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour, and she was glaring at me like I'd just trespassed on sacred ground. I waved politely, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest. "Morning, Karen," I said, though I knew she wouldn't return the gesture. She didn't. Instead, she pulled out her phone and started dialing. My stomach sank. My first hours in my cabin were about to be interrupted by a woman who believed the world revolved around her. Within 15 minutes, 2 patrol cars rolled up. Uniformed officers, polite but cautious, stepped out and approached me. "Sir, we received a complaint," one said, clipboard in hand. "I'm the new owner," I explained. "I have every right to be here. The property's fully legal." The officer nodded, scribbling notes, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. Karen was persuasive, and she painted a picture of a threatening new neighbor with alarming efficiency. For a moment, I felt my dreams slipping away under the weight of her hostility. But as the day unfolded, something unexpected happened. Other neighbors began emerging from their homes. There was Laura Jennings, a retired nurse who had lived on the lake for over 20 years, carrying a basket of freshly baked cookies. Tommy and Rachel Williams, a young couple with 2 kids, came over waving and introducing themselves. Even George Matthews, the old man who lived at the far end of the dock, tipped his hat in greeting. Each of them smiled at me in quiet defiance of Karen's theatrics. It became clear, Karen's grip over the neighborhood wasn't as ironclad as she believed. By evening, the moving truck was empty. My belongings were scattered across the cabin, boxes piled high in the living room, tools leaning against the walls, the scent of pine mingling with the cardboard. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stepped onto the porch. The lake reflected the fiery hues of sunset, and the world felt impossibly vast and serene. Then, the SUV returned. Karen wasn't leaving. She parked near the entrance to my driveway, phone pressed to her ear, muttering about violations and illegal occupancy. I wanted to scream, to tell her to get lost, but I didn't. Instead, I smiled, taking a deep breath of the crisp evening air, and waved to my new neighbors. Some of them had even joined me on the porch. Together, we watched as Karen stomped her feet in frustration, realizing her solo campaign of terror wasn't going as planned. That night, as I lay in the old cabin bed, listening to the soft ripple of the lake and the distant call of a loon, I realized something. This wasn't just about a cabin or a complaint. This was about community. And no single person, no matter how loudly she screamed into her phone, could dictate the lives of everyone else. Karen had called the cops, yes. But in doing so, she had united the neighborhood in ways she couldn't anticipate. By sunrise, I knew what had to happen next. I wouldn't back down, and neither would my new friends. Little did Karen know, this battle had only just begun. And by the time it ended, the rules of Lake Ridge were about to be rewritten. The next morning, the lake was calm, almost eerily so, as if the water itself had sensed the brewing storm. Mist rolled lazily across the surface, curling around the dock posts like fingers reaching for secrets. I stood on the porch, sipping black coffee, and watched the sunlight pierce through the trees. For a moment, it felt like peace, then the sound of tires crunching gravel shattered it. Karen Whitman had returned. This time, she wasn't alone. A small caravan of cars rolled down the winding driveway, each carrying some member of her self-appointed HOA army. They parked with military precision at the entrance to my cabin, and Karen emerged first, clipboard in hand, her expression a cocktail of indignation and triumph. "Ethan Parker," she called, her voice carrying across the property like a gavel striking a courtroom. "I see you've chosen to ignore the covenants. I'm afraid I'll have to take further action." I set my coffee down, feeling a strange mix of irritation and amusement. "Good morning, Karen," I said evenly. "We're all here enjoying the lake. You're welcome to join, or you can go." She blinked, momentarily caught off guard by my calm tone. Then her face hardened. "You're out of compliance," she said, tapping her clipboard like it held the power of life and death. "I've spoken to the HOA. They're prepared to file fines, issue citations." At that moment, a chorus of voices rose behind her. The neighbors I had met the day before, Laura Jennings, Tommy and Rachel Williams, even George Matthews, were stepping onto the porch, one by one, forming a silent wall of support. Laura, carrying her basket of cookies as if to assert both normalcy and defiance, spoke first. "Karen, we've all read the covenants. Ethan's property is completely within legal bounds. He's done nothing wrong." Tommy added, "Yeah, we're tired of this. Everyone deserves to enjoy the lake without harassment." Karen's jaw tightened. She looked at me, as if I were the ringleader of some insurrection. "This neighborhood runs on rules," she snapped. "And I will enforce them." George Matthews stepped forward, cane tapping against the wooden deck. His voice was slow but sharp. "And you will enforce them on your own property, Karen." "But Ethan's cabin? He's within his rights. You can't bully everyone into submission." For the first time, I saw doubt flicker in her eyes. She looked around at the faces of the neighbors, ordinary people who had found courage in numbers. Karen had assumed control, assumed fear, assumed silence, but here, silence didn't exist. The confrontation escalated as she pulled out her phone, presumably to call the cops again. But the officers who arrived this time weren't as easily swayed. Having already investigated her previous complaint, they asked questions, checked permits, and reviewed property deeds. Karen's voice grew frantic as her authority slipped through her fingers. "This is harassment," she protested. "This is criminal intimidation." "Sir," one officer finally said, addressing me politely, "everything checks out. You're allowed to be here, and your neighbors are right. No violations exist." Karen's shoulders slumped for a moment, but she quickly composed herself. If she had expected submission, she was in for a shock. The neighborhood wasn't just siding with me, they were questioning her, openly, for the first time. Over the next few days, Karen's antics grew more desperate. She issued letters threatening fines, organized meetings to discuss compliance, and even attempted to block my driveway with garden cones. But every attempt was met with quiet resistance. Laura's husband brought over a stack of firewood for my cabin without asking. Tommy Williams lent me his trailer to move a stubborn old sofa. Even George offered his old rowboat so I could fish without interruption. The neighborhood was quietly, but decisively, uniting against her petty rule. One evening, I hosted a small gathering on my porch, under strings of warm lights. Neighbors brought food, shared stories, and laughed at old local legends. Karen, of course, did not attend. And yet, I knew she was watching, seething from across the lake, phone in hand. "Looks like she can't handle people choosing happiness over rules," Laura said with a grin. "I think she underestimated the power of a united community," I replied. It was then I realized something crucial: Karen's power relied on fear and isolation. As long as people were alone, her threats carried weight. But together, her influence crumbled. And if she thought she could bend the lake to her will, she was in for a long, bitter lesson. The turning point came unexpectedly. Karen attempted to escalate matters legally, claiming zoning violations and unapproved construction. She even hired a lawyer, citing the HOA's authority to dictate property modifications. But when the local county office reviewed her claims, they found them baseless. Ethan Parker's cabin complied with every regulation. The HOA had no legal standing to enforce arbitrary rules beyond the covenants everyone had agreed to. News of this ruling spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Karen's credibility, once untouchable, was in ruins. Neighbors who had previously stayed silent began speaking up, sharing stories of her manipulations, and documenting every incident. Within days, the HOA itself faced an unprecedented backlash. Membership dropped, influence waned, and the local council began investigating their practices. By the time I returned from a morning run along the lake trail, I found a small, handwritten note pinned to my cabin door. "This isn't over, Parker." I smiled. Karen's warnings no longer carried the same weight. I placed the note in a drawer, alongside her previous complaints, as evidence of her increasingly desperate and ultimately futile campaign. The community had stood up not just for me, but for every resident she had bullied over the years. The lake, once a stage for conflict, had become a symbol of resilience. Each ripple in the water, each reflection of sunlight, reminded me that this place belonged to everyone who respected its peace, not just one woman's desire for control. That night, as the cabin's old wood creaked and the fireplace crackled, I realized the significance of what had begun. Karen had called the cops, tried to intimidate me, and escalate her power, but in doing so, she had ignited something far stronger than fear: a community that refused to be controlled. And the fight wasn't over yet. Karen's stubbornness ensured that the next phase would be even more dramatic, but now, we were ready. Together. The calm surface of the lake belied the storm beneath, and I felt the thrill of standing at the center of something far greater than myself. Karen had underestimated me. She had underestimated all of us. And she would pay the price. The morning sun rose over Lake Ridge like a beacon of clarity, glinting off the water and warming the dew-kissed pines. I stepped onto the porch of my cabin, breathing in the crisp air, listening to the gentle lapping of the lake against the dock. It was quiet, too quiet. But I knew better than to assume peace when Karen Whitman was involved. By now, she had exhausted every petty tactic at her disposal: lawsuits, complaints, barricades, and endless phone calls to local authorities. Yet with each failed attempt, her desperation became more evident, her control more fragile. But the neighborhood? We were ready for the final act. It began subtly, with whispers and phone calls. Laura Jennings organized a meeting of all residents who had suffered under Karen's reign. Tommy and Rachel Williams coordinated with neighbors to collect evidence of her abuses: letters, recordings of HOA meetings, photographs of blocked driveways, and the countless fines she had attempted to levy without legal authority. George Matthews, ever watchful, had amassed decades of knowledge about the covenants and municipal regulations. By noon, the neighborhood had a plan. Karen thought she could intimidate us individually, but together, we were unstoppable. I watched as neighbors gathered at the community hall, a mix of relief, determination, and righteous anger written across every face. "Today," Laura said, addressing the crowd, "we take back Lake Ridge. Not for revenge, but for fairness, for every family who has ever been bullied by the HOA. Karen has overstepped her bounds, and the law is finally on our side." Her words ignited a quiet roar of agreement. It was a rebellion of civility, a united front built on years of quiet frustration. And Karen? She had no idea what was coming. The showdown came that afternoon. Karen appeared at the front of the hall, clipboard in hand, attempting to assert authority. "Everyone, listen, this meeting is official. The HOA has the right to enforce community standards." I stepped forward, calm but firm. "Karen, your authority is null. The county has reviewed your complaints, and your actions have been deemed illegal and harassing. You and your HOA have no standing here." Her lips quivered, not with anger, but disbelief. She had always thrived on the unquestioned obedience of others. Now, that obedience was gone. The room was filled with neighbors who had once cowered in silence, now staring back with unwavering eyes. Laura presented the collected evidence, item by item. Fines issued without cause, complaints filed improperly, threats of legal action without any legal basis. Even Karen's lawyer couldn't deny the mounting proof of misconduct. The county representative, who had been invited to witness the proceedings, nodded solemnly. "Based on these findings," he said, "the HOA is hereby suspended, and its authority within Lake Ridge is revoked. Karen Whitman is personally responsible for any further harassment or legal infractions." The room erupted. A mix of cheers and relieved laughter filled the air. Neighbors embraced, shaking hands, sharing smiles that had been withheld for far too long. For years, Karen's iron-fisted rules had cast a shadow over this community. That shadow was gone. Karen's face flushed crimson, a mixture of rage and humiliation. She opened her mouth, tried to protest, but no words held power anymore. Her threats had dissolved under the weight of truth and unity. With a stiff nod, she left the hall, her clipboard clutched like a lifeline. Her SUV disappeared down the winding road, the final traces of her influence fading with each turn. The aftermath was quiet but profound. Residents returned to their homes, doors open, gardens tended, docks repaired, and fences painted without fear of arbitrary fines. I walked down to the dock that evening, leaning on the railing and watching the sun sink into the lake. The water reflected gold and crimson, mirroring the warmth and relief that filled the neighborhood. "Looks like peace finally returned," Laura said, joining me with her ever-present basket of cookies. I smiled. "Thanks to everyone here. We did this together." George Matthews came down next, cane tapping against the wooden planks. "Never underestimate what a united community can do," he said with a wink. And he was right. Karen had believed she could rule through intimidation and fear, but the people of Lake Ridge had proven her wrong. Her HOA was banned, her authority nullified, and her legacy reduced to whispers of bitter memories. That night, as the cabin filled with the soft warmth of the fireplace, I realized the true victory wasn't just my cabin, or my personal triumph over Karen's tyranny. It was the spirit of the community, the resilience of ordinary people who refused to bow to unjust authority. That spirit was untouchable, enduring, and it would continue to define Lake Ridge long after Karen had vanished from its streets. In the days that followed, neighbors came together in ways that had never happened before. Barbecues were organized, dock repairs coordinated, and for the first time in years, the lake felt like a true refuge for everyone. My cabin, once a point of contention, had become a gathering place, a symbol of freedom and perseverance. I often stood on the porch at sunset, watching the lake shimmer in colors that no photograph could capture. The mist curled around the trees, the water lapped gently against the dock, and the forest whispered with a quiet approval. The battle was over, and Lake Ridge had won. Karen Whitman, the woman who had once wielded fear as a weapon, was now a distant memory. The HOA she had controlled was gone, banned from the neighborhood, leaving behind only the lessons of arrogance and the resilience of a community united. And as I poured myself a cup of coffee and watched the lake glow in the dying light, I smiled. Some victories weren't just about property or rules, they were about reclaiming dignity, freedom, and the right to live without fear. And in Lake Ridge, we had reclaimed all three. The lake was quiet again. The cabin stood proud, the neighbors were free, and my little slice of paradise was finally mine. Not because I had fought alone, but because together, we had faced the storm, and the calm that followed was sweeter than I could have ever imagined. Lake Ridge had been restored, not to a perfect world, but to one where justice, courage, and unity reigned supreme. And as night fell, the reflection of the stars danced on the water, a silent promise that this community would never again be ruled by fear.